but I'll try to do my best here. And thank you very much for coming today here. I was joking with Norman because we have here a Brazilian, a Mexican, another Brazilian, one that is almost a Brazilian. He's improving his Portuguese. Since he has been living in Brazil for almost 9 years, but he's Portuguese. And I'm glad that he's speaking a much better Portuguese nowadays, right?
Always essential.
Yes. And we have Norman Adorf, an American friend, but that used to live in Angola, used to live in Brazil, and Indonesia, all over the world. So he was very concerned because we just came from different places of the world. I just arrived here late night yesterday, and he was afraid about preparation. They said, Norm, this is Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and Mexico. It's a big mess. No worries about preparation. We'll get there, and everything will be fine.
Too much German in my book.
Yes. So he was giving me a piece of paper, and I have here, actually, like with the guidance. I said, Norm, no worries, we'll get the things done. And then this is how the things work in these countries. You have to get the things done. You know, of course, we have to learn with preparation, organization, with Americans and British, Germans. They get crazy when they do business there. Things does not go very straight as they used to be in Germany or around the world. But in the end of the day, you can get the things done. So, I mean, I'm glad to have all you here. I mean, today we will try to discuss with you the latest developments in Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and Mexico. I mean, this place. I would say Mexico is pretty new, but it's one of the hottest places of the world today. A couple of years ago, Brazil was the hottest place, Angola was the hottest place, Mozambique is something new as well. Brazil and Angola, I think that made a lot of mistakes, regulatory mistakes. Fortunately, they are trying to correct it now. We see the interest, we see what's going on in these countries. And this is what we're going to try to discuss here today. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, one more time.
Well, thank you very much for being here this morning. We're really glad you could come. And as you can see, this will be a roundtable discussion with regard to 4 countries, Angola, Brazil, Mexico, and Mozambique. You may wonder why those countries. Well, first of all, we have a strong presence in those countries, obviously. But more importantly, we thought there was a certain historical, linguistic, cultural tie between at least 3 of those countries, which Angola, Brazil, and Mozambique. But then we thought, well, how can we be here in Houston and not include Mexico, where a virtual revolution is happening in terms of oil and gas? So we thought that it would be good to have the 4 countries here. In terms of the format, basically the idea is to go through each of the 5 topics you see on the screen up here. And basically, I think they're not there. So basically, the idea is to go through
This is Brazil, Angola, Mozambique.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, the main 5 topics we hope to cover are recent initiatives to increase foreign investment, political and contractual stability, natural gas regulatory landscape, local content challenges, and new developments. And we hope to go pretty much through that order for each country and let each speaker give his opinion about what's going on in that particular country. We will have ample time at the end for questions, but we really like to hold the questions off until the question and answer period, so we can make sure that we can actually cover all those topics and that each of the countries gets adequately covered. So basically, what I'd like to do is introduce each of the panelists. Alexandra already introduced himself, but Alexandra is a partner at the firm, and he's head of Mayor Brown's Global Energy Group. To my right, we have Gonçalo Falcão, who is a partner, and he's head of our Angolan practice. Originally hailed from Portugal, as Alexandra said. And basically has been working about 15 years handling Angolan matters. We have Bruno Belchior, who's a partner, heads up our extensive Brazilian practice out of the Rio de Janeiro office. Then we have Francisco Mendes, who is based here in Houston, but since we sit next to each other in terms of our offices, I know that he spends at least as much time in Mexico as he does Houston, and so he's actively involved in our Mexico practice. And finally, we have Paulo Haji, who is heads up our Mozambique practice. He's actually located in the Brazil office, but once again spends a very great deal of time in Mozambique.
I think more by Mozambique than Rio, because I don't see Rio. I think you should move your wife to Mozambique.
So without any further delay, we'd like to go ahead and start our discussion. And the first thing we'd like to do is just kind of by way of background is to have each of our panelists just talk a little bit about, give some background to the particular countries, and then perhaps indicate what some of the more significant developments that there are in each country in 2018 and beyond.
So good morning. Let's start with Angola. First of all, thank you for being here. So Angola, before the oil drop prices that occurred in 2014, Angola was in a quite comfortable situation. Oil production was flirting between 1.6, 1.9 million barrels a day, so more or less the same output of Nigeria. For 1 or 2 years, Angola was actually the biggest oil producer in sub-Saharan Africa. But they were already struggling with a problem, which was declining oil reserves. So the output of oil production was, again, as I said, flirting between 1.6, 1.8 million barrels a day, but they were already anticipating a decline. So they were already struggling to find ways of attracting new investment to their known reserves and unknown reserves. Obviously, in 2014, when the oil prices dropped from 100 to more than 100 to $30 a barrel, things got really rough, not only economically for the country in general, but government realized that, listen, with these oil prices, we will not get existing and future investors to develop our reserves, because Angolan reserves are mostly offshore. And then they started a long path that is about to end, and we will talk about that later, a long path of introducing reforms to boost investments in the oil sector. We will talk about those later in more detail, but basically where we are now in Angola, we are at the end of regulatory reform that hopefully will bring back investments to reinstate the oil production levels that Angola wants.
How about situation in Brazil?
Yeah. I think that the key words for Brazil today are competitiveness and urgency. So it's critical for the country to create an oil and gas market that can be each day more competitive, right? We all know that Brazil lost years of opportunities when decided to have a new regime for the pre-salt area, which is the PSC regime that we have nowadays. We're going to discuss that in detail later today. But in fact, we realized that we lost opportunities, and in the last 2 years, Brazil is actually organizing a new reform. Right? It's a new open in the oil and gas market in Brazil these days, which is even much bigger than the new opening that we have in the late 90s, right? And this new opening actually is a combination of opportunities that the country is promoting, right? Combined with the new reforms, and also the Petrobras divestment that's going on these days. Only in 2018, for example, Brazil is gonna already promoted one bid round, the round 15, which was actually a success. Several majors and super majors made big offers in the bid round, and everybody is really happy nowadays. In addition to that, we have the round 4 for the pre-salt. For the pre-salt area, and it's likely that we're going to have another bid round, the round 5, that will add certain blocks in the Santos area that were excluded from the bid round 15, and also the Saturn area that was excluded from the bid round 4. So it's likely that in 2018, for example, we're going to have three bid rounds. Not to mention that we are nowadays reviewing the TOR, the transfer of rights regime, that granted to Petrobras the right to produce up to 5 billion barrels of oil in certain areas of the pre-salt. It's likely that we will have a bid round also to promote the surplus of the TOR, in addition to the 5 billion barrels that Petrobras has the right to produce. The government is also working on a regulatory, on a legal framework, legal change of the TOR law that will allow Petrobras to assign up to 70% of its rights in the 5 billion barrels of oil that Petrobras has the right to produce. Actually, the current law doesn't allow Petrobras to assign in any way any of its rights under this area. So this is something that the market is expecting, and it's also something that Petrobras is expecting too, because Petrobras needs to keep moving the investments right there. More recently, we also organized in Brazil a program. It's called a permanent offer of areas, on which the companies will be able to have access to blocks that were relinquished in the past or that did not have any offer in the bid rounds. So we are now in the second set of the permanent offer of areas, and the market's very interested in this as well. So this is something that we're going to see. Something that we need to improve in Brazil, that's something that we're working right now, is the offshore. More recently, we promoted a program called REACT, which is the revitalization of the offshore activities in Brazil. I think that for most of the audience here, onshore is not very relevant, but for the country itself, it makes a lot of difference in terms of investments in local communities in order to attract more job opportunities and develop the local communities and so on and so forth. So it's something that Brazil needs to work on. Of course, you have several challenges. We need to improve the environmental license process. We need to improve the recovery factor of shallow waters, attract more investors for these areas, especially investment funds or independent companies that are actually looking at those areas right now, that are under the Petrobras investment process. Anyways, just for as a matter of information about 2018 and the years to come. ANP has recently released data that says that from 2017 to 2027, it's expected 39 new FPSOs will be operating in Brazil, and roughly $250 billion can be invested in development and production. Right. In addition to that, if you consider the amount of capex that will be invested globally in oil and gas fields from 2018 to 2025, Brazil accounts for $8.7 billion, which roughly more than 10% of the total amount to be invested during this period. So I think that we are in the right path if we continue to make the good policy that we are doing these days.
That's really an impressive level of activity, and basically, when I think of other countries having difficulty organizing from time to time a bid round, where you have Brazil managed, how many was it, 5 bid rounds this year?
Three.
Okay, but anyway, it's still quite an accomplishment to do that.
Yeah, this is part of the program of the government, because they have established 2 years ago a calendar for bid rounds. So Brazil will have 3 bid rounds this year. Brazil will have more 2 bid rounds next year, 2 bid rounds the year next after. And what Bruno said about the opening, and you were there in the late 90s in Brazil, in the draft of the regulation, I tell you that right now it's much, much bigger, and the reason is Petrobras is selling. You know, this is the first time in the Brazilian history that Petrobras is selling assets. Not only first-class upstream assets that were acquired by companies such as Total, Star Oil, and others, but also Petrobras is selling almost, I would say almost everything in the midstream and in the downstream. In the midstream, they are selling the pipeline network that they have in Brazil, and if you compare Brazil with other countries in the world, the pipeline network is ridiculous. I don't want to be rude, but it's very poor if you compare with other countries, including with Argentina, for example, where the Brazilian economy is 5 times bigger than Argentinian economy, and the pipeline network in Argentina is 4 times bigger than Brazilian pipeline network. So you can see the opportunity. Petrobras is also, now they have a program that they're going to sell the control of certain refineries. And we are talking about the 5th largest downstream market of the world. So this is in addition to the upstream. And the transfer rights that Bruno is talking about, these numbers, Bruno, that have mentioned, it may change a lot, because transfer rights, we're talking about 6 oil fields with between 15 to 18 billion barrels of oil proven reserves. Gaffney Klein and other companies, they have certified it. Petrobras has the right to produce up to 5 billion barrels of oil in these oil fields, but you have more, let's say 10 billion barrels of oil. The government is trying to put it in a bid round in November just for this area. We are talking about the signature bonus for these areas will be something between 25 to 32 billion dollars. And I tell you that we represent a lot of companies. We see a lot of super majors extremely excited about it and ready to go and to invest on it. And they have to change the law in the parliament, but if they are not able to make it this year, for sure next year they'll make it. And this is what Bruno said. I mean, Brazil needs a lot of opportunities. When the oil price was 110, 115, 90, 100, but now, fortunately, with the regulatory reforms, we see the things on the track. And the biggest issue now for me is environmental. The environmental license for certain areas in the country. There is a law in the parliament, just to complement what Bruno said, that they want to expedite the environmental license in Brazil. When I mean the biggest issue, it does not mean that you're not going to get the environmental license, but it takes too long, and it takes a lot of work. But it is something that they're working on. Please, Francisco, next one, and then we can go back to other topics.
Sounds good. From the side of Mexico, I think the story is a little bit different. Why? Because we're coming from a 75 years control of the state. Through Pemex, does Mexico state have full control of the oil and gas activity? And I'm referring right now to the oil and gas activity, although I'll talk a little bit as well about the power generation. And why I make the difference is because in 2013, the oil and gas activity was open for the oil and gas sector, and from 2008, the power generation was open for private investors. It didn't work that much from 2008 to 2013, the power generation. Why? Because it was basically dedicated to the consume of whoever was producing the power generation. Now today, everything is open. And when I say everything is open, we have the power generation, we have the oil and gas, upstream, midstream, and downstream activities. It took basically 2 years to set up the amendment to the Constitution. Second, to draft all the secondary legislation. And finally, I would say that in mid-2016, all the year of 2017, and now this 3 months of 2018, we have had so far in Mexico 107 contracts, talking about oil and gas. And in the side of the power generation, we're now in the process of the auctions for purpose of the production of the generation of electricity. What are the significant developments that I would say we're going to see in 2018 moving to the future in Mexico? Basically, I would say continue with the tenders. And this is because right now we're looking that the new areas are being set up by the Energy Ministry. They are trying to move fast because of the elections that are coming out on July the 1st. So they want, as soon as possible, we move maybe with one more, and in addition to that, try to see if they can work things about the farmhouse. Now I mentioned farmhouse because these farmhouses are to make joint ventures with Pemex. And Pemex, which by the way, they kept the best of the best in the oil and gas sector in Mexico. So I can tell you that right now what Pemex is struggling is with finance capabilities. They don't have that thing. And when they move up to the deep water, they also have a lack of technology, lack of know-how, how to produce the oil and gas in the deep or ultra deep water. So I think it's the moment today for oil and gas companies to move up to try to do something with Pemex. Although Pemex is going to be strong. They are still Pemex. They believe they are still the national oil and gas company. They want to impose tons of rules in those countries. But listen to me, they need changing. Last but not least, something that we need to keep in mind is the presidential elections. So far, polls in Mexico are still giving the majority or the winning aspect to the left side, Manuel López Obrador. But I was checking those polls before this conference today, and thankfulness, the PAN with the young voters in Mexico now is ahead of López Obrador. What is what we have seen in the last 18 years? Because López Obrador, this is going to be the third time he's running as a president. Everything is fine. He keeps the majority of the polls, but as soon as he starts talking, the polls go down. Notwithstanding, I would say that if López Obrador were to win the elections, my view is that the amendment to the Constitution, which was done in Mexico by the PRI, obviously accepted by the Congress, is an amendment to the Constitution that I would say is shielded. They will need more than 2/3 of local and federal Congress to amend the Constitution. So I don't envision that even though if López Obrador comes into power, he's going to be able to do it. But I have to be honest with you, kind of the things that he would be able to do is delaying permits, delaying authorizations, as Alex was mentioning. And this is something that happens in all the countries that I've been working with. The issue about obtaining the drilling permits, import permits, for all the things that are needed for the industry is a big topic. And here, what the PRI and the PAN were working is to try to simplify from an administrative perspective those requirements. If López Obrador comes in, I'm sure he's going to try to set up different rules. But the other thing that is for sure, Mexico needs money. Pemex doesn't have money. If they want to bring and continue with declining of the production, that's the way to go. If they want to move up, they need to go up with the energy reform, which was an opening of the sector, not a privatization of Pemex.
So finally then, Mozambique, I know there's been a lot of expectation for many years in terms of the vast amount of gas that Mozambique found and to know when that would finally be developed. So let's see if you can give us an update on how things are looking in Mozambique.
Mozambique is a new and very promising frontier for oil and gas projects, especially for natural gas. And since the major projects in the country are starting right now, it's important just to go a little bit back in time for a short history to explain how Mozambique is and what's the opportunities going ahead. So, petroleum activities in Mozambique dated from the beginning of the 20th century, but they just had the major discoveries in the 60s. And since the 60s until late 90s and beginning of the 2000s, nothing was going on in terms of exploration and production. But in 2000, Mozambique signed its first major project, which was the onshore areas of Panditemani in the Mozambique Basin, which is in the middle of the country, operated by Sasol. They found some discoveries of about 5 TCFs of natural gas there. and started to develop a pipeline to link the producing fields of Pandi to South Africa. And through this pipeline, which is of about 850 kilometers, there are 5 delivery points of gas that has been firing gas to power projects and also the Maputo industrial area. So basically this is the project already in production in Mozambique since then. It started in 2004. And after that, some new bid rounds were happening in the country, especially in the Rovuma Basin area, which is the very promising area in the north of the country with the border with Tanzania. And just in 2012, so very recently, they found massive reserves of natural gas in Mozambique of around 200 TCFs that could go up to 270. That will put Mozambique between the 4th and the 7th largest natural gas reserves in the world. So the projects going on there right now are very significant for the region and especially for the country in terms of numbers. Just to give an idea, those projects are split in 2 areas. Area 1 operated by Anadarko and Area 4 operated by Eni. Before that, Mozambique was already experiencing a very significant growth in the economy of around 7% a year through the last 20 years. And one of the projects that basically changed the landscape of the country, which was the coal mine of Vale, the Brazilian mining company, they invested $10 billion and basically changed the economy. So those LNG projects in Area 1 and 4, there is some expectation the investments could reach around $90 billion. That will dramatically change the country in a general way. And besides the LNG projects that will export the gas, there are some domestic projects as well for the usage of the natural gas. Gas to power projects, gas to liquid projects, fertilizer projects. So the landscape in Mozambique is very, very promising, especially for companies interested in developing projects of natural gas. Basically, that's it, just to give a general outlook of Mozambique and recent developments and trends.
Great. So it's no secret that with declining oil prices, we've had declining oil investments throughout the world, and this has really worried a lot of the countries that rely upon petroleum investments. And so I think we'd like to discuss now basically what it is specifically that the governments representing these 4 countries have been doing in recent years in order to incentivize more investment in the petroleum sector. Let's go ahead and start with Angola.
Okay, so when I ended my introduction, I told that the trending topic for Angola now is increasing production. Just to put you all in context, so Angola has one of the highest government takes in the world. Is one of the most expensive countries in the world to actually be engaged in petroleum exploration and production activities. And Angola could afford to impose such a high government take because most of the blocks that are on production today, they were awarded in the 90s. And back then, the geology of Angola was already well known. So when these blocks were awarded, people know, so the state and the companies, that there were significant reserves to be explored. So Angola not only imposed high bonuses, but also a very high government take. Most of the Angolan blocks are explored through production sharing agreements with a petroleum income tax of 50%, which is quite high. These conditions usually work well with high outputs. So you can live with high government takes when you are working with huge reserves. And Angola experienced this for a long time. But the thing is, with the challenge of declining reserves, you only have 2 solutions: or finding new areas, finding new reserves, or try to look at what you have and check whether you are taking advantage full advantage of your reserves. In the case of Angola, it's very special because Angola, some of the Angolan blocks, together with the known major reserves, there are significant marginal fields. They are standing there for a long time, and that were uneconomical to explore under the general production sharing agreement tax conditions. So the priority, the first initiative that the Angolan government took after the oil price drop and the need to reboost production was to finally put in place a special tax framework for the marginal fields. Angolan law already provided for a long time that companies could negotiate special conditions to explore marginal fields, but the Angolan government and Sonangol, the concessionaire, for many years, they never had the initiative to look into this carefully. And now that they realize that you may have an opportunity there, the new framework was negotiated and is about to be enacted. And basically, it will allow existing contractor groups from blocks to finally have the advantageous tax conditions that they need to explore the marginal fields. And this is the primary hope to increase oil production in Angola. Then there have been discussions on the eventual potential of the Angola onshore. Geology on the Angolan onshore is not well known. There's still a lot of things to be done. As most of you know, Angola had a long civil war, more than 35 years. So the Angola onshore was not, was in the first place, there were a lot of landmines that had been eliminated throughout the years. But the onshore was kind of forbidden territory for a long time. So we understand that in the coming years you will see geology being acquired in the onshore. There are some areas like the Kwanza Basin and the Congo River Basin that may have some potential, and probably we'll see in the coming years bid rounds covering those areas. So on the petroleum side, again, the major initiative has been the enactment of a marginal field special tax regime, which hopefully will boost production on existing concessions. And then we have natural gas. We will talk about that later, just to give you a heads up. So Angola natural gas exploration up until now had a major constraint, which is natural gas found on concessions, according to the law that we had until now, belonged to Sonangol. So the name of the game was whether you find petroleum or nothing. Because if you find gas, Sonangol will take it from you for free. We have a new natural gas law being negotiated. It's about to be put in place very soon, which dramatically changed the scenario. So the natural gas will allow contractor groups to finally take possession of that gas and sell it to international markets or develop other projects, and this will obviously change the nature of the spectrum of the Angolan resources. And basically this is it.
So you outlined what Angola is doing. Have you seen indication recently of increased interest in the country by potential investors? Are you seeing them?
Yes, definitely. Obviously, the marginal special tax regime was aimed basically to allow existing contractor groups to explore marginal reserves that already exist. In terms of attracting new investments, I would say that the main factor would be the fact that Sonangol is it's public because the CEO is saying that Sonangol acts as a twofold role in Angola. It acts as national concessionaire, but also as an operator. So Sonangol has actual stakes in participating in various blocks. And the new government, the new president, has gave instructions to Sonangol to focus on its concession role. So Sonangol is interested in probably assigning some of its stakes in various blocks, including production blocks. And this represents an opportunity to companies to go into Angola and acquire these blocks.
This is through Sonangol BNP?
Through Sonangol BNP. This is fresh news, actually.
Okay.
This is fresh news. Sonangol BNP is interested in selling some of its stakes in Angola, and this is a way to have new and fresh investment going into the country in this sector. So there is a renewed interest in Angola.
Yes, for the ones that are not familiar with Angola, Sonangol BNP is the concessionaire, the ones that sign. Can you hear everybody if I speak? Yes. So Sonangol BNP is the concessionaire, the ones that signs the concession agreement with the IOCs, and Sonangol BNP is a kind of, I would say, a private arm of Sonangol, including activities outside Angola. They had recently they had activities in the Gulf of Mexico, and they have activities in Brazil and other countries in Africa.
Let's change the order of countries. Let's go to Mexico now in terms of discussing, again in the case of Mexico, what it's been doing specifically to increase investment in the country.
Okay, on this specific topic, what I have to say here is that we should be dividing a little bit what are the aspects of the things in Mexico. If I were to talk about oil and gas, what I would say is that the government is looking to continue with tenders of oil and gas blocks, which are going to be onshore, offshore, shallow waters, and now for the next auction, they're looking to go with the unconventional resources. That's one thing. What they're going to be now looking in front of them is unitization. A lot of the blocks that were given in Mexico, onshore and offshore, they are small blocks. They didn't follow the rule of the international concepts of having big fields. These are small fields, so we can see right now that there are going to be issues with unitization. In the side of the midstream, Mexico, the only facilities they have is what Pemex was able to build. Basically, that's it. So what everybody's looking now is build up of pipelines. We may have a grid that is coming from the north to south of Mexico, and it's directly from Nuevo Laredo, just going in the center of the country. But if you go to the west of Mexico, you don't see any pipelines. When you go to the terminals, you may see 3 or 4 in the Gulf of Mexico, 3 or 4 in the Pacific, and that's it. If somebody were to ask me, where do I see the best place to invest in Mexico? It's precisely in the midstream. Why? Because there are no facilities for that. And you have the need for the two things. For the upstream, which is all the oil and gas activities that are going to be done, and the downstream. And when I say downstream, it's the gas, it's fuels. This is a new business in Mexico. It was also on the hands of Pemex. Today, if you go to the numbers in the CRE, you're going to see that since the reform, 2.2 gas stations were built up as new gas stations. Those were outside Mexico City. In Mexico City, 0. There has not been one. Although I have to say, and I think there's somebody from Total here, but I like to see the Total brand in Mexico City. They took over the Pemex gas stations over there in Mexico. I would say Mexico City is Total, BP, you have Chevron, you have the Mobil brand outside Mexico City, Mobil in Querétaro in the center part, you can find Chevron in the northwest part. But this is a business that's going to start growing as well. And again, the point is the lack of facilities to have to handle the fuels. This is with regard to the oil and gas. With regard to the power generation, right now there are tons of tenders that are looking to extend the grids of the electricity. CFE, the power company, is looking for investors to come build, operate the grids. The owners want to be the CFE of those things, but there are good studies from a financial perspective, and it's a profitable business as well. And the last concept I would bring here to the table is all those service contracts that are related to each of those companies. If I go to the upstream, everything that's required for the drilling of a well, for the production of crude, for the production of gas. When I go to the downstream, all the pipelines that are needed over there, new technology. We have heard a lot that people are stealing the gasoline from the pipes. It's a matter of technology in America, how to handle things. So I do see Mexico as a good opportunity for investment.
Thank you. Let's move it back here to Brazil, and Bruno, maybe you can let us know what specifically Brazil is doing to bring even more investment into the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Norman. As Alex mentioned before, Brazil lost a big opportunity, right, in the past when it decided to move to create a new regime, the PSA regime, right? Just to give you an example of that, and then we can talk about what we have been doing to actually improve and create more opportunities and investments in Brazil. When we excluded from the round 9 41 blocks, right? We lost, this is ANP data today, the opportunity to produce about 4.3 billion barrels of oil, the opportunity to invest about $200 billion, and the opportunity to have about 30 FPSOs nowadays working. Right? This is just because we excluded from the round 9 41 blocks. This is a data, of course, from ANP. But since the impeachment of the former president, right, Brazil understood that it needed to catch up, to make the lost not an opportunity to regret, but to move on. So the first thing that we did, and it was very important, we changed the pre-salt law, right? Brazil changed the pre-salt law to remove the sole operatorship rule. So nowadays, Petrobras has a preferential right in the pre-salting areas, and also a pull-out option, right? In case the offer of profit oil, of course, in those consortiums in which Petrobras is not participating, is high, and the company understands that it could not attend. Actually, Petrobras supported this change because in the former regime, Petrobras did not have the pull-out option, so it created to the company great exposure because it was exposed to what the investors would do in the bid round, since Petrobras had to attend as an operator with at least 30%, right? Of course, it also guarantees to other players the opportunity to participate as operator in the pre-salt, which is another way to attract more investments to Brazil for different players, for different operators in the very promising actually fact pre-salt areas. In addition to that, Brazil decided to organize an agenda of bid rounds. That's what Brazil did. So in the end of 2016, Brazil announced bid rounds for 2017 and also 2018. So Brazil organized in 2017 3 bid rounds, the 14th bid round for concession and the 22nd bid round for the pre-salt, which were of course very successful. In 2018, for example, as we mentioned before, Brazil already organized 2 bid rounds and is going to organize another one. So in addition to that, we promoted some important changes in the local content rules, right? Nowadays the rules are much more flexible. I think we're going to talk about later about local content, so I'll wait for that. And there are several measures that Brazil is promoting. We talked about that before. The change in the TOR law, a new bid round for the surplus of the TOR. Local content, as I mentioned already, we're going to talk about it later. A new gas law that you're also going to talk about. We extended the repertory regime so that the companies could benefit of a tax regime for the next 20 years. And I mean, Brazil is actually doing what it can and is actually working to do what it can to improve the regulatory framework in order to attract more investment. And it's very clear, the market's very clear for everybody, and the clear signal is that we're having significant investments nowadays, and the presence of majors and super majors that in the past did not believe in Brazil, but nowadays they're actually giving the sign that they will to believe.
Yes, I like to think about the past and talk about the past in order to do not commit the same mistakes that you committed in the past. And when Bruno's talking about the new regulatory framework of the pre-salt, actually, personally, although I'm not in favor, and I was not in favor at that time discussing with the government that we should change the regulation for the pre-salt blocks, in this case the PSA, I think that it was not the biggest mistake, because the concession is there for the areas outside the pre-salt area. So we have PSA for pre-salt and concession for everything else in Brazil. But I think that the biggest mistake, and you have a combination of issues here, was the fact that we did not have bid rounds for 6 years, 5 years, 5-6 years. At that time, everybody was excited about the big oil discoveries in Brazil. For 5 years, the government was thinking about the future. The Lula government, they were saying that the pre-salt would save the Brazilian economy, would save the country, and would make Brazil a very rich country. It's rich by numbers, but not rich if you get individually. I mean, it's among the top 7 or 8 largest economy of the world, but with a lot of social problems. And you have a combination of it that we always had in Venezuela and other countries of the world. Oil price was very high. They thought Petrobras could make everything, could invest in everything, could be everything. You know, it's worth to mention that in 2009, with the capitalization, was 2009? 2010. Petrobras was the third largest oil company of the world by market cap. You know, so it's in 2010. I mean, not many years, I mean, 7-8 years ago, but it was the third largest oil company of the world. Much bigger than Chevron, much bigger than many other oil companies. And then they thought
and the capitalization was the biggest in the world.
Yes, and the capitalization of Petrobras was $50 billion capitalization, the largest ever. We did not see anything so big, and even nowadays, nobody made such big capitalization as Petrobras had in 2010. So, and what happened? I mean, oil price very high, everything concentrated on the hands of the government, car wash. The largest corruption scandal of the world. I mean, the biggest oil discovery, the largest. Brazil is a lot of big things, big parade, Carnival. So yes, and I think that car wash, honestly, and we have to talk about it. I think it is an opportunity for Brazil, for the energy industry, and for the Brazilian people, because we have been seeing now that for the first time in the history, the big guys are in jail. I mean, everybody knows that Lula has been in jail for almost 2 weeks. People in France, I don't know if I have French friends here, but they like Lula. I don't know why they are. I think, but I talk a lot with my French friends about Lula. I don't know why they like him, but he's in jail. Nothing happened. But what's going on in Brazil right now? That with the big scandals, I think that it has bring up a lot of opportunities and a shift to the right thing. And what is the shift to the right thing? Petrobras realized that they cannot do everything alone. They realized that they need partners. They realized that they have to be more humble. I mean, they did not humility. I mean, they have to be more low profile. I mean, for the ones here that used to have experience to negotiate with Petrobras several years ago, it used to be very tough, a very nose-up approach. Very unfair approach, and now we see a different company. Look, yes, you used to work for Petrobras, but Petrobras International, you were in Venezuela. Petrobras International used to be a different company from Petrobras in Brazil. We used to have 2 companies. one in Brazil and another one outside Brazil. In Brazil, they thought that we are Petrobras, we don't need money, we have enough cash. If you want to do business with me, it must be on my terms. It's different now. And this is the opportunity. And what is the opportunity? As I said, Petrobras is divesting everything in the midstream and downstream. I would say almost everything. They are divesting a lot in the upstream. What's going on now, different from Mexico, is a privatization. I don't work for the government, although I have a lot of friends there, but it's a privatization. When you are selling assets, important assets, the pipeline, the Southeast Pipeline Network, $5.6 billion. The Northeast Pipeline Network, you have, it's already public, you have two consortiums of major private equity funds that they offer $8 billion for the Northeast Pipeline Network. The upstream assets to Star Oil, $2.5 billion. Upstream assets to Total, $2.4 billion. So Petrobras is selling, and selling a lot. And which is good, because we're going to have more players, different players in an open market. And if you talk to these guys, not publicly, but let's say having a beer, they would like to privatize the company. They cannot do it now, but they are doing it now with Eletrobras. That is with CFE, and the Chinese, it's among the top 5 largest power generators of the world. And they're trying to privatize Eletrobras. It's a big discussion in Brazil. It's the equivalent of Petrobras in the power sector. And if they are able to privatize Eletrobras, I will not be surprised at that anytime soon they are going to privatize Petrobras. And this is something that I have to mention, and honestly, it's a really, really big shift in Brazil. I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago saying that Brazil is leading the Latin America to the right. Hopefully, Obrador will not win the elections in Mexico, okay?
I'll send it to Brazil.
Yes, he's leading, I can't seem to lead with Lula. So, in jail. Brazil is leading to the Latin America, is leading Latin America to the right. And it's true, we have Brazil, Argentina, we still have Ecuador, little change. We still have Colombia, they are always on right, I think, in the right path. I'm a big fan of Colombia. We have the issues in Venezuela, it's a big turmoil, but I don't think for how long they're going to support the current regime. And I think the biggest issue in Venezuela that they have been losing a lot of brains. A lot of good brains of Venezuela. They are moving somewhere in the world, a lot of them in Houston, and which is too bad for a country when you lose your brains. No matter if you have the good things, but if you lose the brains, you cannot do good things with the good things that we have in the country. In this case, a lot of oil in Venezuela. And Bolivia is very small, but at some point they are going to shift to the right as well. So I'd like to let you know these thoughts, because it's very important to think about what happened in the past, what we did wrong, and what we cannot do again to do better for the future.
So we've pretty much covered the, in terms of government incentives towards investment, except we haven't heard yet from Mozambique. So obviously Mozambique did itself a great favor in terms of finding 150 whatever TCF of gas in calm seas and in close to good markets. But what's the government itself doing to even further boost investment in Mozambique?
In terms of foreign investments in Mozambique, differently from the other countries, Brazil, Mexico, Angola, where you have structured ongoing assets to be sold, in Mozambique, most of the new projects, they are greenfield. Everything needs to be built. But that's where the opportunity really is. So Mozambique misses all the infrastructure and all the development in the sector. And exactly because of that, the government is very willing and is making policy through the years to attract foreign investments. So as a new frontier, I would say, even comparing to the neighboring countries and also in a global-wide analysis, the Mozambican framework is very friendly for foreign investments. So it's very stable, not only politically, but also in terms of the legislation. And besides of that, the terms of the country are very reasonable for oil and gas in terms of governmental take, and also for general investments in the economy. So the tax system is relatively simple. with some reasonable rates, and also it's a very flexible regime for foreign investments, not necessary to have a JV for most of the sectors, and it's very, even if you have a JV, it's very free in terms of the forms you can adopt to implement the JV. So, and that is making some results. If you see the numbers, as I mentioned before, from 2000 to 2015, Mozambique might be between the 8-7 highest GDP growth in the world through this period. And they are expected to grow even more as soon as those large natural gas projects took off. It could easily reach the #1 or 2 position in GDP growth in the world, according to The Economist. So, to brief resume in a general way, I would say Mozambican policies are very friendly. Besides being friendly in the standard of the law, Mozambican authorities are legally allowed to give you even more benefits for investing in the country, provided that you commit to invest anything more than $100,000. It could range from tax incentives to enlargement of quota for expatriates and many other benefits. So if you have any projects, the message that the entire legislation and the government likes to pass is, please come, present your project. Definitely we'll take a look, and you're going to find some opportunities here.
The flexibility is key, because I remember in Angola when we were trying to negotiate some of these marginal fields, the fact that there was simply no departure from existing terms set us back many years, I think.
Yes, it's good to I mean, I can tell you by my experience, I was a little bit surprised when I started to work in Mozambique that the regulatory framework is very modern. Actually modern, I'll tell you. And the reason is because since they don't have money, they need to be financed by the World Bank. So the World Bank hired the consultants to work for Mozambique. And then they hire the consultants where in the US, sometimes in Brazil, or in Europe, and then they draft something very modern, open, and I would say stable for the country. And different from other countries in Africa, when they used to have a lot of money, they try to establish their own rules. In Mozambique, no, they have the oil and gas regulatory framework. They have a petroleum agency. The national oil company play by the rule. They don't have any kind of benefit from the government. So I was very surprised and positive surprised about the regulatory framework.
Let's stick with Mozambique for the next topic. Basically, the next topic is political stability and contractual stability. And everybody knows that when profit margins were going down and certain countries were experiencing political instability, that political stability became more and more important. And my question to you is this: when I remember negotiating the Tamani PSC back in the 1990s, late 90s, and they had one of the most investor-friendly stabilization clauses I remember. Like, maybe that's because that was before finding all that gas, but basically it was that if the investor feels that it's being prejudiced by some kind of rule change, it could basically itself change the production sharing splits. I'm just curious as to whether or not that clause still exists in their model, or they've gone beyond that.
That's true. The clause that was adapted for this initial project in Tamani was very friendly, if you can say, in terms of political and fiscal stability and tax stability. It remains in the entire legislation. Mozambique changed its law in 2014, the petroleum activity laws, and consolidated some of the tax practices in one single law. In a general way, it didn't change what was happening before. It just consolidated some of the practices, explained a little bit more some details that were missing in the former legislation, and kept some of those friendly clauses for investments as the stability clause. The new model of concession contract in Mozambique, it's a concession contract. It's called concession. The government insists it's a concession, but they have a production sharing mechanism. So under our international analysis, it will be more a PSA than a concession agreement if you go to the merit. And this new model still has the stabilization clause, and particularly, but of course, is a more narrow wording than it used to be for Pandita money. It gives you basically 10 years of tax stabilization, and if there is any significant change, of course, there is an ability for the parties to discuss the terms. And even the new law that came in 2014, expressly mentioned that all the previous agreements covered by the previous law, the concessionaires could choose if they want to remain under the former law or adopt the new laws. The same thing happened for the tax laws and for other major sectors as mining as well. And particularly for the LNG projects of Area 1 and 4, due to the necessity Mozambique needs significant resources, international resources to develop those fields, the regime is very flexible in all its senses, especially for structuring project financing. In other words, it says you can provide any kind of rights and assets in order to find a financial arrangement. So I would say, and besides all that, Mozambique has a very good track record in terms of respecting the agreements. You don't have any history of statization of any projects, any companies. So I would say the legislation in a general way, and also the particular agreements, they are very stable for foreign investment.
Yeah, I guess if we'd asked the question 100 years ago with regard to Mexico in terms of how are things going in terms of political stability and contractual stability, the answer would have been optimum. But let us know how things are looking these days. Francisco.
Okay, well, and I think we're short on time, right? So
we're okay. Yeah,
Okay.
We'll deal with it.
Well, what happened in Mexico is that back in 1938, we had the expropriation of all the oil and gas sector. That's known by everybody. And from there, the story in Mexico is different. They've been kind of honoring their contracts. We had the sugar mills that were expropriated in the time of Echeverria, which is 10, 15 years from now. But that was more kind of a need for Mexico. Since then, what you really have in Mexico is a similar thing in Mozambique, and I'm sure in Brazil about this, is that the government is looking to honor their contracts. One of the things that are very important to mention about Mexico is that they do have signed so far 32 free trade agreements and 45 BITs. So it's really important how you guys organize your corporate structure to look for the protection. Rules in Mexico with regard to the oil and gas contracts are going to be the laws of Mexico. And only for the administrative recession, we would have to go to a procedure in Mexico through the amparo. All the other can go arbitration outside Mexico with applicable law of Mexican law, but outside of Mexico. So from my kind of general perspective, I think investors are fine. I did mention the concept of the administrative rescission in Mexico because that's a big thing that all the investors in the oil and gas industry have to be aware of. Specifically, there are 7 reasons why government can set up and claim the administrative rescission, but the one that bothers me more is if somebody stops production, if there's a fatality, one fatality, and there's an accident, that is enough for the government to take over the project. It's a big issue. What we were able to set up there was not to have this in a kind of automatic, because it was getting in the law that it was going to be in a process of 60 days. Today we're looking out that there's going to be a process that can go up to 2 years, and they really have to demonstrate that there's a reason to go to the administrative rescission. This is an administrative issue, and if guys are here involved in the oil and gas sector in Mexico, you will know that these contracts are no longer administrative acts. This is civil code, this is commercial code, these are contracts with the private investors. So I'm sure that if something happens in the future, we'll have to go to the courts for arbitration and find a way how to set this stuff. But in general terms, I feel in Mexico, and they have shown with a NAFTA story with the United States since 1984, and with other countries that they honor the contracts and they look to continue and protect investments.
Great message. And without stealing Bruno's thunder, I'm sure he has a very pretty picture to paint with regard to Brazil and political and contractual stability.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, nowadays we see that the rule of law actually works in Brazil, right? We see Lula, the former president, he's in jail. So we see clearly an independence among the powers. And the judiciary in Brazil is really independent. So in addition to that, all the concession contracts and the PSAs have a arbitration clause that guarantees to investors the right to go to arbitration in case of a dispute with ANP. And we've seen already disputes against ANP, and there's no problem. And we've seen these days disputes against ANP in the arbitration court. So our perception in Brazil is that there is no doubt that the rule of law works, right? So in addition to that, we actually have no history of breaching contracts, no history of expropriations. I have nothing to say, about Brazil in terms of political instability, right? I have just to say the opposite. And these days, actually, even more. And if you see the future, if you see how Brazil is operating these days, which are the outcomes of the car oil operations, and so on and so forth, we see that the country is moving towards a direction where it's going to respect even more the contracts, right? We don't see the Supreme Court, for example, ignoring, right, the rights that were already acquired by a concessionaire, by investors in Brazil. We actually don't see that.
It seems that sometimes you have like a lower court that will maybe give an unfavorable opinion, but it seems to be quickly rectified. It
is quickly rectified, absolutely. If you go to the next level, and then if you go to the Superior Court, to the Supreme Court, there is no doubt that will be rectified, absolutely.
I remember when...
There is something that I like to mention, and this is a good example. When you hear these questions about expropriation or protection of foreign investments, about Brazil, it's interesting. I was a couple of years ago in Singapore with the General Counsel of Temasek, and she asked me, Alex, what about in Temasek? They have a lot of investments in Brazil nowadays. She asked me, Alex, what about expropriation law in Brazil? And then, big table, I was with a couple of partners from Hong Kong, and I did not know how to answer. When she asked me, and then I look at her and say, it's a good question. I can tell you that we don't have an expropriation law, but I will look for what we have in the law that protects investments in Brazil. And then I told her, do you mind if tomorrow I sit down here and explain you, because honestly I don't know, I have to check it. This is something new for me, this kind of question, how to organize this kind of answers. And then the day after I sent her a note about the issue. First of all, we don't have expropriation case in Brazil. Or to be honest with you, we had one in 1902, the power utility company of Rio de Janeiro that used to be owned by EDF, Electricité de France. The power utility was expropriated by the government of Rio de Janeiro, and then in the late 90s when they privatized it, was acquired by EDF again. So the French, they liked it so much, like the power utility of Rio de Janeiro, that they were expropriated in 1902, and then they gave back to EDF. And then looking at the Brazilian constitution, and this is something very interesting about Brazil, as you may know, there is no difference between private or foreign investment in Brazil. Once you establish a company in Brazil, you are a Brazilian company for all purposes of law, no matter if the investor is from China, US, no matter, it's a Brazilian company. And you have the same rights and obligations as any other Brazilian company. And also if you look at, so this is something that we have to mention, there is no requirement for any, of course there is some restrictions for nuclear, communication, airlines that they are removing now. Nowadays, only Brazilians they can own airline companies. It's not so true because Latam, with Chile and TAM, they were able to organize. Lawyers are very creative, so they found a structure that the Chileans can control TAM, and they have the largest airline company in Latin America. And it's also worth to mention that the Brazilian market is the third largest of the world after US and China. And they're about to remove the restrictions for foreign investment in airlines, and be sure that United, Delta, Air France, they'll try to buy the Brazilian airlines. But also, talking about it, in the Brazilian Constitution, there is an article that is very clear about the protection of private investments, not foreign investments. And the reason is, if you protect the private investments, you protect foreign investments, because as I said, once you establish a company in Brazil or an entity, it's a Brazilian company for all purpose of law. So I like to mention it because, and the conclusion is, fortunately we don't have expropriation issues in Brazil, and even having a leftist government for almost 15 years with Lula and Dilma, for almost 13 years, Lula 2 terms and Dilma 2 years and 2 years something. We did not have any issue about expropriation or change in the contracts in Brazil. At some point with the discoveries, with the pre-salt discoveries, the government, I can tell you, they thought they were flirting a lot with Chavez and others, and Bolivia, the friends of Lula, Chavez, Morales, and the guy in Korea that left Ecuador, and Kirchner. So it's a good team, right? Say they were flirting, they were thinking about to change the contracts over the pre-salt, but to get it done in Brazil, they have to go through the parliament, the Congress. And if you look at the Brazilian parliament, different from Venezuela, they are all entrepreneurs. They are ranchmen, they own telecommunication companies, they own companies, they are entrepreneurs. They are not, I mean, of course, we have like 10% of the ones that they scream all the time without nonsense ideas, but most of them, they are very conservative. Very, very conservative. And as I said, I mean, and then we never had expropriation, and Brazil has the tradition to respect the contracts. If you talk to the IOCs and that they have invested in Brazil, major, super majors, or even independents, I'm sure that they have been doing their homework. We don't have any case in Brazil about any change or any major change in the contracts regarding infrastructure, oil and gas, or anything else in Brazil.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and see what the situation with regard to Angola and political and contractual.
Very well. So starting by saying that Angola is living a new political moment. So since 2017, we have a new president, Mr. Lourenço. Mr. Lourenço came after more than 30 years presidency by Mr. Dos Santos. Just to put you in context, so Angola took independence from Portugal in 1975. For the first 2 years after independence, the first president was Mr. Agostinho Neto. He died, and soon after, Mr. Dos Santos was just a boy with less than 30 years old. He took office, and until last year, when he took the decision, I won't say unique, but almost unique within the African political context, of deciding not to run for the next election. This was expected but surprising. You don't see that many often, African leaders running countries for so many years, taking the decision to leave office and transfer the power to somebody else. So this was a very wise and good move from Mr. Dos Santos. Mr. Dos Santos, there's many things we can talk about his legacy as president. So he ran the country throughout the Civil War. He negotiated peace in 2004. But oil and gas wise, his greatest legacy was undoubtedly political stability and contractual stability. So many of the PSAs that we have today and that are responsible for the major oil operation in Angola, they were awarded in the 90s. And when foreign investors started to take interest for Angola in the 90s, you don't have like a major track record of contractual stability to convince those international investors to invest in Angola. Well, but Mr. dos Santos used a case study that perhaps is unique in the world that happened in Angola. So Angola, when Angola took independence in 1975, the main producing block was Block 0. Block 0 was awarded by Portugal to Gulf Oil in the late 50s. And what the new independent government of Angola did was to, after independence, was to renegotiate the Cabinda concession, the Block 0, using the exact same terms that Portugal initially negotiated with Gulf Oil. And Block 0 is producing until today and is the only association contract in Angola. All the rest are PSAs, and I have a few reservice agreements, but Block 0 is operating under an association contract because Angola, back in the 70s, despite gaining independence, didn't want to, challenge what the former Portuguese government has negotiated. So, and in the 90s, when Angola started, their first promising breeding grounds, they used this case study as a very important element to say, listen, we didn't change the terms for Gulf Oil after independence. So we need to rely that we will stick to the terms of the contracts that are being negotiated by us and not by the formal colonial power. So, and after so many years, after more than 20 years of PSAs in Angola, we can say that contractual stability is no doubt a given. You don't have one single case of arbitration between the Angolan concessionaire, Sonangol, and contractor groups. Of course, like in many countries, sometimes you do have changes in the law that may or may not impact ongoing operations, and that may raise some discussions, etc. That's natural, but usually Sonangol and Angolan government always took the approach of trying to negotiate the terms if necessary, adjust the agreements if necessary, and keep the stability as they can. So I would say that contractual stability in Angola is no doubt a given, and in the African context, again, this is a very important asset. Talking a little bit about the new President Lourenço. So, of course, he's in office only 8 months now, so it's still a little bit early to try and make an assessment of what he has been doing, but so far it has been relatively unanimous. Analysts understand, and that's my opinion as well, that Mr. Lourenço is taking a more liberal approach to the economy. Mr. Lourenço is re-engaging, for example, the relationship with the US. Mr. Lourenço is trying to increase the presence of US companies in Angola, notably in the oil and gas sector. Of course, Mr. Lourenço wants the US to be a partner, but also other countries, but no doubt he's trying to do that. And one of the key issues that he has to resolve is the still quite bad reputation of Angola corruption-wise. Angola appeared in the last few years always in the last positions in transparency and corruption. Angola, Mr. dos Santos started that work a couple of years ago. Angola has a modern anti-corruption law. Financial supervision is also much more tight today than it was before, and Mr. Lourenço is hoping to continue that work, and he's been struggling to call in representatives of the American government and other countries to actually check what he's been doing in order that Angola can be again seen as a country. Well, you can't say that it will be corruption-free. I think there isn't any country in the world that can say that it's corruption-free, but at least Angola can be back on corruption levels that are at least acceptable and not as they were before. So just to conclude, definitely contractual stability in Angola is a given since independence, so for the last 40 years, and that's the secret behind the fact that today in Angola you have all the super majors operating. You have the US super majors, Exxon, Chevron, you have BP, you have ENI, you have Total and a bunch of smaller companies. So this can be explained only because you have contractual and political stability.
So we promised everyone we'd have a half an hour for questions at the end. So what I'd like to do now is jump to the last subject we wanted to talk about, which is local content. We had gas on the agenda as well, but I think a lot of what we said already applies to natural gas. In fact, the word natural gas, I think, came up more often than crude oil did in this discussion. So what I think I'd like to do now is go to local content, start on this side of the room. And you know, everybody knows that it's good to have a certain amount of local content requirement in terms of manufactured goods, in terms of personnel and everything else. And when times are good, when oil prices are high, it's not much of a burden on oil companies, and they can kind of do what's required. But as prices go down and investment budgets are stretched, the local content can really become quite a burden. So what is the situation in Angola these days on local content in terms of what's required and basically what changes we see? And let's try to keep it to about 3 minutes per person if we could, so we can make sure we have some good time for questions.
I'll be quick. So in Angola, the local content issue and the local content discussion can be divided into two topics. The first one, probably the one that is most successful, is that, you know, if you are doing this in Angola in the oil sector, you are required to have, you know, training programs in order to foresee the substitution of expats, employees by Angolans on a medium to long-term range. You know, this is being implemented for many years quite successfully. So if you are an oilfield service provider, you have to get an agreement with the Municipal Petroleum whereby you commit yourself to train local people to replace expatriates. You know, this is not an easy process, but to a certain extent you can say that it has been successful. For instance, Norman worked many years for BP in Angola, and nowadays most of, you know, BP management guys, they are Angolans. Right. It's a very, yeah. So on the side of the training, I would say that the Angolan approach has been successful. On the other side, which is, you know, the need to partner with local partners in order to do business in the oilfield service sector. Well, you know, the law in Angola is very open. So in theory, if you are an oilfield service provider, you don't really need to partner with a local entity if the kind of services that you provide are, you know, complex and technologically complex. But in practical terms, what happens is, because Sonangol, the concessionaire, has the legal ability to approve all service contracts that operator want to enter into, Sonangol ends up to, you know, in a diplomatic way, favor those that bid through joint ventures where you have an Angolan partner. And, you know, this is a problem, not only compliance-wise, but also technically, because although today you have some Angolan companies with capabilities to, you know, partner with international companies, many of those partners don't have that capability, so they end up having a silent role, which is very bad for the venture as a whole. You know, it attracts all sort of compliance issues. Things are improving. Again, you have nowadays in Angola still a small group, but you have a group of Angolan companies with technical capabilities that you can partner with to pursue oilfield services in Angola, but that is still a problem and is being reviewed, so the Angolan government is aware that the proliferation of some partners is not a good thing, and we should be seeing, you know, new regulations coming up to try and, I would say, not to persuade, but to kind of promote Angolan partners to invest more and take a little bit more risk whenever they partner with foreign entities.
So in terms of Brazil, I know it's been kind of all across the map over the last several years, so let us know where things were and where things are now.
It's true. And it's good that other countries like Mexico is learning with Brazil mistakes, right? But the fact that the local content policy in Brazil failed. It didn't work. The local content obligations have been extremely high, right? And actually proved to be inefficient, and unrealistic, right? If you consider the Brazilian market, what we could provide. So, and the controlling system, which was based on a list of roughly 90 items, was extremely complex to be followed and also to be audited by ANP. Right? So, because the fear of penalties, because this was actually the local content policy in Brazil, based on penalties mainly, several companies could not comply with the local content penalties, and then they were obliged to present to ANP waiver requests, which gave to ANP an enormous amount of work. For instance, there are several concession contracts that were still not audited by ANP yet. So the Brazilian government had to do something, right, to change the local content policy, which obviously failed. So the bottom line is that the local content policy rules were inefficient, very had costly methods, and absorbed the culture that favored more punishment and fines than actually a real improve in the domestic market through the Brazilian companies, right? So in the round 14, mainly, the local content policy changed dramatically, right? The local content policy is now it's not anymore a bid criteria, right? In the bid rounds, and the controlling system is much more, is less complex, right? Because it's divided into environments, onshore and offshore, and in the offshore we have only two divisions of exploration with a lower percentage of local content, and also development production, divided not only in 90 or 80 items that we had before, but into well construction, collection and offloading system, and production units. So it makes that the local content policy, at least in terms of compliance and audit to ANP, much easier, and the level, actually the amount of percentage is much lower these days. So there was a big discussion at the time when the government implemented this new policy, but the truth is that both the market, whether in the side of the Brazilian companies, whether in the side of foreign companies, they were satisfied with the new policies.
So maybe, Francisco, you let us know how the Mexicans learned from Brazil's mistakes, as if you care to put it that way.
Yeah, of course. And one thing that happened in Mexico is that when the government was drafting legislation, they took three legislations to look for. One was Colombia, because it was already in Spanish. They were going to kind of save some money on the translation. The other one was Brazil. In Brazil, they were specifically looking what things went wrong, what things were good. And for the case of Norway, everything related to the oil and gas fund. So basically, those are the three, let's say, legislations that came up to bring the Frankenstein, that's how I call it, the legislation in Mexico. With regard to local content, I would say it's easy in the sense that in the hydrocarbon law, you have that during the first 25 years, you have to get to 35% of local content. But this is just for onshore and shallow waters. If you go to the deep water or ultra deep water, what the government said, we're going to go lower down the number. And they go specifically by contract. And you will see that in the contracts are going to say between 9 to 12, 13%, no more than that. They realize that, as we saw over there in Brazil, basically you had all the clients preparing the fine they were going to pay because they were not going to reach the local content. In the sense, Mexico, they realized that the figures of the local content, they reduced them. Having said this, we have to be very careful because they did set up rules to apply for the local content. Just to give you an example, if you hire a company that's going to make a survey for purposes of the studies in deep water, the impact assessment, and environmental impact assessment. The vast majority of those boats are U.S. or foreigners. They're not Mexicans, even though they have the flag of Mexico flag. Careful, because that's not going to be part of the local content. And the other thing, we do have licenses and we do have PSCs. Specifically in the PSCs, we should follow all the rules, because if not, the government is going to reject the amounts we're putting here to the cost recovery. So we have to be a little careful.
Great, thank you. Let's wrap up the panel discussion with comments from Paulo with regard to local content requirements in Mozambique. And then we'll go into the question and answer session.
Just as Mexico, Mozambique is inspiring itself in some ways in Brazil. Exactly, to take a look of some of the policies that didn't work in Brazil, the ones they should not follow, and the examples as well that are working well, due to all the similarities of the entire legislation, legal system, culture, etc. Has been one of the major inspirations by Mozambique, together as well in some instance with Norway, just like happened in Mexico as well. In terms of local content, since the Mozambican scenario is totally different and is one of the least developed countries in the world, especially in terms of industrialization, in terms of complex services, and the availability of general products and services in their economy, Mozambique has much more flexible rules and lower standards in terms of local content. So in basic terms, Mozambique has a general rule on the law similar to Angola, that provided that you have goods and services of a similar quality, a preference should be given for local producers, local providers, and it can end up with on top of 10% preference to those local companies. And also, whenever you associate with local companies, you might have this preference in most of the tenders. And how you can associate with the local companies is something also very open in the legislation. You could either incorporate together a company, become shareholders if it's an incorporated JV. If it's a non-incorporated JV, you can take some of the forms allowed. The most common are consortiums. Or it could also be subcontracting structures. So it's very freely how you can have this relationship with the local companies. And besides of that, Mozambique, especially the new legislation and also the tax legislation, provides that for you to have some of the costs, they can be recovered. You need just to follow some tender and publication rules, and a local preference is given just for a small amount of contracts. For major contracts and for more technological service or goods, you have several waiver possibilities to hire directly in the international market. Besides of that, the new legislation imposed some items that could be considered local content as well. Similar to Angola, it's very important to show that you're going to train and overturn in the midterm most of your expatriates to local workers. You should present a plan for that, and as much as you can present plan hiring local Mozambicans or changing your staff, more the government will be willing to give you those incentives. That's the basic rule for applying for some of the incentives the legislation provides. Some of the three key points that created some of the discussions in the new law were, first one, the necessity of channelizing 25% of the natural gas or oil produced to the domestic market. That's something that creates several discussions, but it's more advanced. Some of the projects are already selected, as I mentioned, gas to power, gas to liquids, fertilizers, and for all those projects you might have to make the separation for domestic sales and international sales. Besides, another one is For the rules that will apply to the concession process, the bidding, there's a separate law that applies for all the mega projects, including oil and gas. And this mega projects law that provides those rules for the tenders and concessions in a general way, the demand that you give a 5% free carry to the government, especially for projects where you're going to be using natural resources. And on top of the 5%, from the next 5 to 20%, you should list the company, preferably to list, you should provide this equity to Mozambicans, preferably through listing in the stock market and to Mozambican national individuals. But that's something that is not implemented yet. It's pending some further regulation to explain this a little bit more. And it's especially exempted for Area 1 and 4 project in the LNG decree law. So, in short, that's the major local content rules in Mozambique.
One little comment here. Just be sure to hire a local law firm. Yeah, and that's what we call for the local content.
Great comment to wrap up that session. So basically now we'd like to open this up to your questions. And if you don't mind identifying who you are and whom you work for would be helpful, not required. But any questions for the panel?
Sheldon Stoughton, NatWest Advisors. Lisa Del Mendes, did you say that the CFE has to own all new IPP plants? Or, I mean, is there some way under which somebody could invest on a BOT basis, or is that required? What's the regime there?
The rules right now is that IPP, they are the owners of the IPPs, okay? But the trend is to make that be part of the opening of the energy sector. I was once asked what was my view with regard to the CFE and PEMEX and the energy reform. The way it was drafted, I would say that in a mid-long term, the idea is to have PEMEX and CFE disappear. It will all go to the private investment hands. Quicker, CFE. The one that's going to be taking longer is PEMEX.
No questions, yes. Yes.
Continuing with Mexico, Carlos Ortiz with Rowan Companies. There's been some sort of confusion in the market relative to the enforceability and the clarity of the local content rules in Mexico. What's your take, and what are the consequences for failing the levels that in some cases are by contract in the case of deep water, or mandated by regulation in the case of shallow water and onshore?
Yes, right now we're just starting with the activities. There are a few blocks that are under production. Just take in consideration that the first blocks were granted back in 2015, at the end of 2015. The economy ministry is open to dialogue, specifically on problems that each of the blocks would have. But notwithstanding, the issue here and actually, let me tell you this, for the exploration phase of the deep water blocks, you're talking about 3%. I think it honestly is quite easy. For the shallow or the other ones, they are moving in the 25-year term that I mentioned up to the 35%. So if there's a way that you believe that you're not going to be able to fulfill the commitment that is by law and in the contract, just go back and let's go with the energy, the economy ministry, demonstrate why we cannot get to that specific thing, and they will be open to that. We have had already cases.
Thank you.
We had a question over here.
Yes, Colin Johnston with C Nation. My question is aimed more at the actual the major production regions, so Brazil and Angola, and as to whether there's any insight there on how the authorities are trying to drive, using Norway as the model in terms of the recovery, and seeing how poorly efficient the recovery is compared to Norway, particularly for the deep water production environment, and if there's anything, any viewpoints there in how that is developing to force the operators to improve that production profile. Excuse me.
Bruno, may I just give some words? I mean, when you mean the technological, or what is the regulatory approach from the government?
Well, the area that I'm involved in is actually on the technology side to undertake that from a service point of view. But it's partly driven, you know, there's an incentive for operators to improve the recovery, but some of that is also driven from regulators.
I see. I'll give you some words about Brazil, and then I will discuss it about Angola, because they're doing the same in Angola as well.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what the government can do is reduce the government takes. When you reduce the government takes for the old oil fields, then you can attract investments in order to keep these oil fields producing more and for a longer time. There is a discussion in Brazil right now, and there are two leading cases that we are working on, both actually, related to two oil fields. One is regarding Polvo oil field, and it's public, it was on the newspapers, with PetroRio, a small Brazilian public oil company, where they are negotiating with the Brazilian government the reduction of the royalties in exchange of investments and to produce more oil for a long time. So it's a kind of revitalization of an old oil field that they can produce more for a long time, reducing the royalties. And another one is with Chevron, with Frade oil field, that they are trying to reduce also the royalties in exchange of further investments in these oil fields. There are many others in Brazil. I mean, if you look at the Star Oil, they just acquired a major one that used to be one of the largest oil fields from Petrobras, that I'm sure that at some point they will request the government to reduce the royalties in order to invest more money to keep these oil fields producing for a long time. But there is a resolution from the National Petroleum Council telling that, I mean, basically instructing the petroleum agency to work on a regulation in order to improve or to improve the recovery of this oil field for a long time, and in exchange, and basically I think the government too is a reduction of the government takes in Brazil, the reduction of royalties, in order to create incentives to the oil companies to invest in these old oil fields. I don't know if I have answered your questions, but this is what's going on right now.
In terms of regulation and predictability, there is also an instruction or guidelines from the Minister of Mines and Energy, which authorize NEP when there is an extension to the concession contract, right, to reduce the royalties up to 5%. So it's already an authorization from the Minister of Mines and Energy to NEP to proceed like that in order to consider the recovery factor as well.
In respect of Angola, that's a major issue in Angola actually, because as I mentioned initially, so Angola has a high government take. It is true that some of the major producing oil fields are already on the way down, which means that the problem that you raise sooner or later will come up. And the new government, as I mentioned, firstly, focused on creating more attractive rules for new marginal fields. And I believe that all the Angolan law provides the way out, so you can actually try to negotiate better terms, investment premiums, in order to make the last years of production more effective. The way provides that way out. You don't have that many, specific discussions going on yet. I believe that sooner or later the government will take a look at that more closely, especially in respect of the major fields. But I'm sure that sooner or later Angola will reply to that. But it's actually a problem nowadays because you don't have a clear way out. Okay.
More questions? Yes.
Hi, Jacqueline Weaver from the University of Houston. So could you talk for a minute about stabilization or just the stability of local communities when you're doing a lot of onshore bid rounds are starting to come up, and what it's like in the 4 countries with the local communities? It seems just hunky-dory with the federal government.
Should we start? Look, you're ready to.
In the case of Mexico, what you have is by law in the contracts, the government gives you a base. It is called the base situation of where are the local communities. They give you the analysis from a social perspective, and when you take over the field, it's going to take to be 18 months that you need to provide what's going to be what you really have, what you really receive, and what's going to be the outcome, what are you going to do. You have by obligation, by the contract, to set up a specific amount of money to be used for the local communities. And this is with the oil and gas, onshore, offshore.
And pipelines, what happens there?
Pipelines. What you have in pipelines is basically you have to negotiate the right of way in the pipelines. And in case that you do not reach an agreement with the owners or the local communities or what is called ejidos in Mexico, there's a new figure that the government and actually is a judge is going to come up to the specific amount that will be paid to the owners of the land. And this is with regard to a market situation. So this is to protect the owners, but on the other hand, to make all the projects work. Because there are times that when you don't reach an agreement between the owners and the ones that want to run the pipelines, what you do is just stop down the projects.
Sounds like Professor Weaver wants to hear from each country, so let's go ahead and start with.
In Angola, we still don't have, like actually onshore ventures in production. The only example that we have is the Angola LNG project, whereby a major plant was built in the Soyo River, in the margins of the Congo River, in Soyo, which is the last city on the north of Angola. Needless to say that the impact of building such a major factory to local communities was high. The project was subject to a specific legal framework whereby Angola LNG, socially wise, was committed, and they did it, to compensate the impact of building the plant by housing construction for the local communities, refurbishment of the roads, and they built a new city surrounding the plant. So the trade-off was basically to round up the lives of the communities by improving the infrastructure that was there before. So that was the way that Angola found out to compensate the impact. But again, this is a very specific project, and it was a large investment, $9 million. So investors were able to actually compensate with major infrastructure improvements. In respect of any new ventures that may come up onshore, I understand that a similar policy will be used. So basically the trade-off will be, okay, occupation of land and impact on social community must be compensated with any sort of investment to improve the lives of those local communities.
I can say that Brazil is actually similar to Mexico, right? And as we were discussing before, the onshore activities are where the opportunities to the local communities are, right? Where they're gonna improve, get job opportunities, and so on and so forth. In Brazil, there is a protection for the local communities on both sides through ANB and also during the environmental license, because the environmental authorities are usually very concerned about how's going to happen, what's going to happen with the local communities when there is a exploration activities there, including of course the construction of pipelines. We have the same policy in Brazil. The owners of the lands, they have some participation, right, in the production when there is production, and the NEP is also involved when it's necessary to authorize, right, the passage of pipelines through owners and through lenders and through the local communities, especially onshore.
For Mozambique?
For Mozambique, to answer this question, it's important to clarify how is the law regarding, for all the land issues, local communities and resettlement, they are all connected. That's something that's very particular in Mozambican legislation. As Alex likes to say, it's a jabuticaba in Mozambique. It's something very specific.
You have to explain what jabuticaba is.
Yeah. Jabuticaba is something very specific to that country. We say that in Brazil because it's the fruit that just happens in Brazil. So the land rights laws in Mozambique are very particular as well, because there you cannot have the ownership of the land. The ownership is of the state. What you can receive is a concession to use and enjoy the land. It's a concession for 50 years, renewed for more 50. And to acquire that, you have to present your project, and you receive a provisionary duat, is the name of this right, this concession, for 2 years. And after 2 years, they will make an inspection to see if you're fulfilling your project. And if you are, you're going to receive a definitive duat for 50 years. But the thing is, Mozambique is still a very rural country. About 70% of the population is in rural areas. So most of those mega projects that would use a significant amount of land, extension of land, will demand at some point this negotiation, resettlement, etc., which is in this duat law that will apply for oil and gas and any other sectors. So all onshore projects, pipeline projects, energy production, generation, and transmission projects will have to face that as well. So what's the process? In this initial phase of presenting your project and obtaining the initial duat, you have to make a preliminary phase of negotiating with local communities, with the local leaders of rural communities. They have to agree to receive the project. Of course, it's time consuming, and in particular in the oil and gas sector, there's always an involvement of the government. Besides, all of this is taken by a different department, different ministry. The energy ministry gets involved as well to make this happen, to facilitate the process. But during this process, you have to commit to make a resettlement plan for all those communities that will be affected. So after it happens and you receive this duat, you're going to have your project, and whenever the duat ends for whatever reason, if it's terminated, if the company wants to cease the concession or for any other reason, you just have to give the preference back for those communities that you resettle. So basically, that's how it works there.
Time for one or two more questions, depending on the complexity. Oh, there are quite a few questions. Let's use the time, please.
Yes, Diogenes Bermudez, Independent Consultants. I have actually, if you allow me, two questions, brief.
Okay.
Yes, one for Brazil. And is, you mentioned that there are environmental issues ahead. Could you share some more about what the main challenges are in relation to the environment? And the second question at once is for next. You mentioned that we would see probably many unitization issues there in Mexico. Do you think that the matter is adequately regulated, the unitization matter in Mexico?
Well, I'm not an environmentalist, but based on our experience, right, in dealing with environmental issues involving in the oil and gas industry, I wouldn't say issues, right, but we need to improve our process, right? It takes a while to give the concessionaires or the contractors, in case of PSAs, a license in Brazil. So what we need to do is to create a culture, okay, of environmental license in Brazil for the oil and gas activities. There is no issue on those areas that are already known by the environmental authorities. But when it comes to new areas that are still unknown or still under development, especially on the new frontier areas, the environmental authority has a procedure to understand a lot about what's going on in that area before granting the license. Right? In addition to that, sometimes it requires that the investors, that the concessionaires, commit, right, to very significant commitments which are actually beyond what they should do and actually what the government or the administration should do and not the companies themselves, right? But those are the main issues. I think it's a matter of working on the process, creating a culture of licensing, environmental licensing in Brazil, so that we could have a better process, especially for those new frontier areas.
With regard to unionization, what we have in Mexico, they just published right now the unionization guidelines. It is not the best way to handle the unionization, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, what has to be done is have the two companies, the two parties or three parties together and define how they are going to handle, who's going to be the operator, where they're going to be operating, from where they're going to be operating, and how the payment of the fiscal terms is going to be done. The way that has been right now drafted in Mexico, set up by this, the CNH and the Energy Ministry, is basically that the government is the one that's going to basically direct what's going to be the terms of the unionization. They're going to hear the parties. So if you have the resources extending to the other block, what you have to do is go to Sener, knock the door, listen, my reservoir is extended to this one specifically. Maybe it's handled by Pemex, maybe it is used by private investors. They will call these guys, they will have to prove that the resource is extending the block, and then the CNH is the one that's going to be setting up the how the unionization is going to work. But again, what I do see in Mexico is that this is starting in Mexico. So authorities are quite open to listen.
Time for one more question. Marina, I think you had your hand up before.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get them both. Okay.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to hear from Alexandre and Bruno how you see the coming elections impacting the sector in Brazil, and if you have any concerns also about the timeline of the bid rounds. You knew this was coming.
No. The question is about the future elections, and the bid rounds. And I'll try to make. I was yesterday trying to answer the same question. Not yesterday, on Sunday evening, having dinner with the top legal team of the super major, trying to explain it. I think that the elections in Brazil is a little bit uncertain. What is certain that Lula will not run. You see that a lot. And I think that the leftists in Brazil, they are not well organized they are not well organized because everything is around Lula. Since he's out of the game, it's very difficult for them to organize themselves to win the elections. I'm afraid about Ciro Gomes. I don't know, for the ones that does know Ciro Gomes, he studied in Harvard, but he's very, I don't know, we're not sure about what his plans, but I don't think that he would have an appeal. I hope that the center and the people that from PSDB, Democrats, the ones that are moving the reform in Brazil, even PMDB, the good part, at some point they'll get together, and I think that I have been watching some signals about it in order to, when you see that in Salvador, for example, in Bahia, the mayor of Salvador that is not running for the government, and he has been saying that they have to put themselves around only one candidate. I think that I have been watching some change. But in the other hand, if you look at the other candidates, such as Marina Silva, that she was numbered the third in the latest election, she was delivering an interview yesterday saying that she's committed with the fiscal stability and the opening of the economy with focus on the social development, which is good. If you look at the crazy guy that sometimes people like to compare him to Donald Trump, I don't think he's like Donald Trump. I think he's like the guy in Philippines. Do you care? Bolsonaro, that he has like almost 20% of the voters. He's a former military guy. Honestly, I will not vote on him, but between Ciro Gomes and Bolsonaro, I prefer him because his Minister of Finances will be Guedes, that used to be the head of Goldman Sachs in Latin America. So you see the mindset of this guy. So I think, Marina, that we have a very small chance to have the crazy guys back to the power in order to interrupt or stop everything that was being done so far. But even if we have these crazy guys, when I mean the crazy guys, maybe Ciro Gomes is the one with more chance, even Lula. I don't think he'll be so bad because he's pragmatic. He's very pragmatic, different from Dilma that has ideology. Lula's ideology is very pragmatic. It's about, he was partner with everybody, make money for him and also for his partners, everybody else. But it's a very tough question to say who will win. The scenario is very uncertain, but I don't think that when you have Marina Silva or even Bolsonaro saying that they are committed with the fiscal stability, with the growth of the economy, I'm not very afraid about the future. And of course, if you have Alckmin or the Meirelles, that is the former Minister of Finance, he just left to run. Just to let you know who is Meirelles, he was the first foreigner to be CEO of a major US bank. He was the CEO of Fleet Bank Boston before the merge with Bank of America, and he was the Minister of Finance of Brazil until 2 weeks ago, and responsible, honestly, one of the key guys for the reduction of inflation and also the reorganization of the Brazilian economy after Dilma Rousseff. Regarding the bid rounds, there is a calendar, a calendar that's already approved by the National Petroleum Council that the Petroleum Agency has to follow. The good thing about Brazil is that no matter who is the next president, the directors of the Petroleum Agency, they cannot be changed. They have stability, so only after 2 years, very similar to what you have here in the West with the Fed, with the Federal Reserve, if I'm not wrong. So, trying to answer your questions, and I don't think I was able to answer this question, which is very tough. I have the hope that among the candidates that we have, the only one that I'm really afraid is Ciro Gomes, one more time. The others, I think that they'll move forward on the same path that we have been moving in Brazil right now, including for bid rounds and the next an opportunity for the gas industry in Brazil.
I actually agree with Alex. It's real uncertain these days because we still don't have a name for the central, right? We have a name for the left a little bit. We have Ciro Gomes, which represents the leftist side. On the right side, we have Bolsonaro. But it's very uncertain because we still don't have a name for the center. So as soon as you have it, I think you have a bigger picture, a better picture on what's going on, what's going to happen in Brazil for the elections.
Yes, it's also worth to mention that these elections in Brazil, just to give you some numbers, Brazilian elections used to be the number 2 in the world in expenses, number 1 US. The latest elections in Brazil, almost 2 years ago for the municipalities, it was a very cheap election in comparison with the elections in the past. And the reason is, nobody talks about it because it's a very local news, but the companies, they are not allowed anymore to finance political campaigns, corporations and companies. So you must have just individuals, which is good because elections, as I said, in Brazil, after US, we were the number 2 in the world to spend money with elections. I think these presidential elections will be extremely cheap in comparison with the other ones. So the show, the business, they'll not make like the big show for elections. And the one that is able to get support in the parliament, and why the parliament? Because it will give you time on TV, different from US. In the US, you pay time on TV in order to deliver your ideas. In Brazil, every morning, in the middle of the day, and then in the evening, the time that everybody's watching TV, the political parties, they'll have like 20 minutes, and also in the radios to tell what they are thinking of, to present their plan for the country. And the time on TV will be important. It's regulated by the number of House of Representatives that you have in the parliament. So in Brazil, different from US, unfortunately we don't have only 2 major parties, we have maybe 5 to 7 major parties. So the candidate that is able to put together more support in the parliament with the House of Representatives, they will have more time on TV. And with more time on TV, you have a huge advantage in Brazil. The good thing is that among 581 House of Representatives, Ciro Gomes party has only 12, and I don't think he'll be able to get support. Marina Silva, which is not so bad, it's something that we don't know yet what she wants, although she has a very good team behind her. I don't think she'll be able to put together the support. And I think that this guy from the center, maybe Alckmin, Meirelles, or Maia, we don't know yet, it's very unclear. I think that he'll be the one able to put together the support in the parliament, and then have like 60% of among this 20 minutes on TV, 12 minutes or 10 minutes, and I think that it will make a big difference in Brazil. Another data that, although we have these many candidates running now, in Brazil, historically, you only know before 2-3 months before the elections who are the candidates. So historically, if you look at the past elections in Brazil at this time, it's the guys that used to be on the top in the surveys, encuestas in Mexico, right? Encuestas. Yes, they used not to win the elections in Brazil. So it's a very difficult question to.
Just to complement what Alex just mentioned, we were discussing yesterday the role of the media today, right? Vis-a-vis the social media, and I think that nowadays, especially in Brazil, it's going to be the first election that will have a strong presence of the social media, and the candidates must be aware of that.
Well, we've run over time, unfortunately, but we're all available here to take questions after the event is over. I'd like to ask Alexander to go ahead and wrap things up.
First of all, thank you very much again to stay here today with us. I think that these countries would deserve maybe one day of discussions if you want to go deeper and deeper in it. But what I can tell you that based on our experience and what we have been doing in this place in the last, let's say, 20 years. Mexico recently with Francisco, but Brazil, Angola, Mozambique is a place that we know very well, working for a long time. Mexico is new, but we have got a Mexican guy. I was talking about you in the dinner that I had with the General Counsel, the super major, that it was very difficult for us to find a Mexican with oil and gas background. When I mean oil and gas, international oil and gas background. Because in Brazil, in the late 90s, when you opened the oil and gas sector, we had at least at Braspetrol, Petrobras International, some Brazilians with international experience in oil and gas. In Mexico, Pemex used to be only Mexico. So we found him at ExxonMobil to work with us. But I think that the present is very good, and the future is bright for this place. I think that in Angola they learned with the mistakes. It's very clear now, I think that they learned it as Brazil because they were into a crisis. They are still facing a lot of exchange issues. They don't have enough international reserves, in Angola, enough international reserves. And they realize that they need partners. They need foreign investments. They need to be nice with the investors in order to build the country. Brazil is the same. I gave you the example of car wash, Petrobras with the mindset and the government that they can do everything. We don't need anybody. We can do everything by ourselves. And now, they realize that we need partners to grow. Mozambique, it's a more, I would say, virgin country in this regard. But as I said, I was very impressed with Mozambique regulatory framework, very modern and pro-business regulatory framework. And Mexico, Francisco, they realized that they need partners as well, right? That Pemex could not handle everything alone. So my perception is that for these countries, unless we have a big shift, the future is really promising. It's bright. And I hope that today we're able to send a message, to tell something a little bit more about our knowledge on this place. And one more time, thank you very much for coming here today.